At 11:32 a.m. over Bremen, 19-year-old tail gunner Eugene Moran watched German fighters close in his B-17 crippled crew, dying sky erupting in flak. Then the bomber split in half. No parachute. Both arms shattered. Still shooting as the tail section fell 4 miles. What happened next sounds impossible, but it's real. At 11:32, on the morning of November 29, 1943, the sky over northern Germany was already on fire. Black bursts of flak clawed at the bomber formations as more than 300 American B-17 flying fortresses pushed toward one of the most heavily defended targets in the Reich Bremen. Kneeling alone in the very tail of one of those bombers, Rikki Tikki Tavi, was Eugene Moran, just 19 years old. A farm boy from Wisconsin, first combat mission, no second chances. The tail gunner's position was the loneliest place on any aircraft. 40 feet of empty fuselage separated Moran from the rest of his crew. No one behind him, no escape route. Just two 50 caliber machine guns and the cold realization that every German fighter pilot in the sky knew exactly where to aim. By late 1943, the math of survival was brutal. A bomber crew needed 25 missions to go home. Most didn't make it past 15. Entire crews vanished in a single afternoon. Deep strikes into Germany weren't called missions, they were called milk runs to hell. German pilots had learned early attack from dead astern, one angle, one gunner. Kill him, and the bomber was finished. As Rikki Tikki Tavi crossed the North Sea in tight formation, Moran scanned the empty sky behind them. He knew the silhouettes by heart, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs. He'd memorized them in training. But training never mentioned the cold. 40 below zero at 24,000 feet. Or how flak felt when it ripped through aluminum like paper. Ahead lay Bremen's factories. Beneath them, thousands of guns waiting to open fire. And behind them, German fighters already climbing. Eugene Moran didn't know it yet, but before this day was over, he would fall 4 miles from the sky and refuse to die. The bombs fell clean over Bremen. 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped away from Rikki Tikki Tavi, and for a brief moment, the crew had done their job. Target destroyed. Mission complete. Now came the most dangerous part, getting home. As the formation turned back toward England, the sky suddenly punched back. A burst of flak detonated near the right wing. Engine number 2 took a direct hit. The propeller froze, windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. Speed bled away instantly. In a bomber stream that was a death sentence. A damaged B-17 couldn't keep formation, and a bomber that fell behind lost the protective wall of overlapping gunfire. German fighter pilots lived for moments like this. Stragglers were trophies. From his tail position, Eugene Moran saw them first, dark shapes rising from below, others diving from above. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs closing fast, perfectly coordinated. 15 of them at least, maybe more. They came exactly where doctrine said they would, 6 o'clock low. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate and squeezed both triggers. The twin .5s erupted, the recoil hammering through his body as tracer rounds stitched the sky. One fighter broke away at the last second, rolling hard to escape the stream of fire. But there was no pause. The Germans attacked in pairs, one drawing fire, the other lining up the kill. Cannon shells slammed into the fuselage. Aluminum screamed. Somewhere forward, a gun went silent. Then another. The intercom dissolved into static and broken voices. Moran kept firing. The temperature inside the tail dropped to 43 below zero. His electrically heated suit struggled to keep up. His breath froze on his oxygen mask. The guns grew hot while his fingers went numb. Then a Focke-Wulf crossed his sights. Moran swung, led the target, and fired a short burst. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It snapped sideways and spiraled down, trailing black smoke, his first confirmed kill. He didn't have time to register it. A cannon shell tore into the tail. Something slammed into his left arm, then his right. White-hot pain exploded through his body as blood soaked his sleeves. Both arms were shattered. Still his hands worked. He could still pull the triggers. More impacts. Control cables snapped overhead like whips. The tail began to vibrate violently. Moran glanced down at his parachute and felt his stomach drop. It was shredded. Useless. If the aircraft went down, there would be no escape. The fighters kept coming. Engine hits. Crew silence. The bomber shuddered like a wounded animal. And then, with a sound Moran would never forget, the airframe began to tear itself apart. Metal screamed. The sky broke open. And Rikki Tikki Tavi started to die. The bomber didn't explode. It came apart. With a shriek of tearing aluminum, the fuselage split just forward of the tail. In a fraction of a second, the front half of Rikki Tikki Tavi, the wing's engine's cockpit, and the bodies of Moran's crewmates ripped away and vanished downward into the clouds. Eugene Moran was left alone, still strapped into his seat, still wounded in both arms, still clutching the guns. The tail section lurched violently, then dropped. There was no parachute, no aircraft, no crew. Just a severed piece of a B-17 tumbling out of the sky from 24,000 feet over enemy territory. Moran knew the math. A human body hits terminal velocity at around 120 miles per hour. The tail section weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. He had maybe 90 seconds to live. The wreckage spun end over end, slamming him against the walls. Wind screamed through the torn fuselage. Blood sprayed across the metal interior as his shattered arms screamed in pain. Any rational man would have shut down. Curled inward, waited for impact. Moran did the opposite. The German fighters were still there. Curious or reckless, they closed in on the falling wreckage, circling it, inspecting their kill. And in doing so, they made a mistake no one had ever anticipated. They flew within range of a tail gunner who refused to die. Moran dragged his bleeding arms back to the grips and opened fire. The spinning made aiming nearly impossible. G-forces crushed him into the seat, then hurled him upward. Tracer rounds arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The sight alone was enough to shock hardened Luftwaffe veterans, a man in a falling coffin shooting back. One fighter took hits across its fuselage and broke away trailing smoke. The rest scattered. Then something incredible happened. As the tail section continued to fall, the spin slowed. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers began to bite into the air, acting like crude wings. Instead of plummeting straight down, the wreckage started to glide. Not safely, not gently, but slower. Seconds passed, then more. The ground grew larger through gaps in the torn metal fields. Forests, frozen farmland, rushing up to meet him. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate, wrapped his ruined arms around the ammunition boxes, and waited. The tail section struck the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Branches exploded, metal tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, smashing into trunks, shedding aluminum like shrapnel. Moran's head slammed into the frame. His ribs cracked. His arms bent in ways they never should have. Then the tail section hit the frozen ground. And somehow, against physics, probability, and reason, Eugene Moran was still alive. Silence followed the impact. Not peace, just the stunned quiet that comes after violence so extreme the world seems to pause. Eugene Moran lay twisted inside the shattered tail section, barely conscious, barely breathing alive by a margin so thin it bordered on the impossible. Both forearms were broken compound fractures, bone jutting through torn flesh. His ribs were shattered. A chunk of his skull was gone, leaving part of his brain exposed to the freezing air. Blood pooled beneath him, already beginning to crust in the sub-zero cold. Every breath felt like a knife driven into his chest. He should have died within minutes. Instead, Moran tried to move. His arms were useless, but his legs responded weakly. Inch by inch, dragging his ruined body through jagged aluminum, he pulled himself toward the open end where the bomber had torn apart. Each movement sent waves of agony through his body. He bit down on his oxygen mask to keep from screaming. Outside, the German forest waited. Snow-covered ground, gray sky, enemy territory. Moran collapsed onto the frozen earth and looked up. He had just fallen 4 miles without a parachute and survived. Only a handful of men in history would ever do that. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death alone beneath the trees. Voices echoed through the forest. German voices, soldiers, emerged from between the pines. Rifles raised, staring in disbelief at the wreckage, and the American airman still breathing beside it. Some shouted orders. One ran toward the road to fetch an officer. Moran couldn't resist. He couldn't even lift his arms. They searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they moved shattered limbs, dog tags, rank insignia, a ruined parachute shredded by cannon fire, proof that he had no business being alive. They left him lying in the snow. An officer arrived later, took one look at Moran's wounds, and shook his head. The American was dying. But orders were orders. Living prisoners were to be captured, interrogated, if they survived long enough. They loaded Moran onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no blanket, no medical care. The cart jolted over frozen roads for hours, each bump sending fresh agony through his broken body. The bleeding from his skull slowed only because the cold froze it solid. At a German military facility, Moran was dumped onto a concrete floor. Guards discussed him as if he were already dead. No doctor came, no water, no bandages, just cold, darkness, and pain beyond endurance. 2 days passed. Infection set in. His arms turned purple and black. His exposed brain tissue swelled. Gangrene crept in. Without surgery, he would lose both arms. Without treatment, he would lose his life. The guards watched him fade. Then on the 3rd day, they moved him again. Another cart, another brutal journey. This time, the destination was a prisoner hospital, understaffed, undersupplied. A place where men were sorted into 2 categories, those worth saving and those left to die. Moran was placed firmly in the 2nd group, but inside that hospital were 2 Serbian doctors, prisoners themselves. Military surgeons captured on the Eastern Front, forced to operate with almost nothing. They examined Moran and made a choice that would defy orders, logic, and expectation. They would try to save him because he was alive, and because some lines, even in war, are not meant to be crossed. The operation lasted 7 hours. There was no proper operating room, no anesthesia worth the name, no antibiotics, just dim light crude instruments meant for field amputations, and 2 exhausted Serbian doctors working on a man everyone else had already written off as dead. On the table lay Eugene Moran, barely conscious, burning with fever, his body ravaged by impact, infection, and cold. His forearms were shattered beyond recognition. Bone fragments protruded through torn skin. His ribs were broken in multiple places. A section of his skull was missing, leaving his brain dangerously exposed. The doctors began anyway. They worked without the luxury of sleep or certainty. Metal pins and wire were used to pull Moran's arms back into something resembling alignment. Infected tissue was cut away piece by piece. The smell of rot filled the room. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness, screaming, when the pain broke through whatever numbing agent they could manage. At his head, the situation was worse. Bone fragments were removed from the skull. Swollen tissue was cleaned as carefully as possible. With no modern materials, the doctors fashioned a crude metal plate and secured it over the exposed area, an act that by all medical logic of the time should not have worked. But it was the only chance. When the surgery finally ended, Moran was still alive, but just barely. The doctors told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. If the infection spread, he would die. If his brain swelled further, he would die. If his body failed to fight, there was nothing they could do. That night, the fever came. His temperature spiked past 104 degrees. His body shook violently, alternating between burning heat and uncontrollable chills. He slipped into delirium, calling out warnings to crewmates who had died months earlier. He screamed for his mother. He relived the moment the bomber split apart again and again, trapped inside his own mind. The doctor stayed with him. They had no medicine to give, only cold cloths, only whispered encouragement in broken English, only the quiet defiance of men who refused to abandon a patient simply because the odds said they should. The second night was worse. Moran's body convulsed. His breathing grew shallow. Other wounded prisoners listened in silence, expecting to wake to the sound of guards removing another corpse. Then on the morning of the third day, something changed. The fever broke. Moran opened his eyes and focused, really focused, for the first time since the crash. He recognized the ceiling, recognized voices, recognized that he was still in the world. The infection had stopped spreading. Against everything war physics and medicine had thrown at him, Eugene Moran had survived again. The doctors examined him and saw the impossible. Tissue beginning to close around the skull plate, bones starting slowly to knit. It would take months, maybe years, to recover if he ever truly did. But he was alive. Word spread through the hospital. Guards came to stare. Prisoners whispered about the American who fell 4 miles and lived. The man who should have died in the sky, on the ground, and on the operating table, but refused every single time to stop breathing. The war wasn't done with Eugene Moran yet, not even close. Eugene Moran survived the surgery. What followed was something else entirely. 6 weeks after the crash, Eugene Moran could walk again, barely. His arms were locked in splints, his skull sealed with a crude metal plate that pulsed with constant pain. He was thin, hollow-eyed, and permanently changed, but alive and therefore useful to the German system. They processed him with cold efficiency. Name, rank, serial number, unit. A photograph was taken, a 19-year-old who looked 40, staring into the lens, with eyes that had already seen too much. Then he was shipped east to his first permanent camp, Stalag Luft 4, barbed wire, guard towers, machine guns. Wooden barracks that did nothing to keep out the winter. Thousands of Allied airmen filled the compound, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. Some had been there for years. All of them were waiting for a war that refused to end. Life inside the wire became a test of endurance. Food was starvation level, thin soup, black bread. Occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages arrived when luck allowed, and when they didn't, men went hungry. Most prisoners lost 20 to 30 pounds. Some lost far more. Moran's body continued to heal, but never completely. His arms regained movement, though the strength never returned. The plate in his skull caused headaches that felt like nails driven into his brain. At night, sleep brought no relief. The crash replayed itself in his dreams. The tearing metal, the endless fall, the trees rushing up to meet him. After 17 months of captivity, Germany began to crack. In the summer of 1944, Moran was transferred again, packed into a cattle car with 60 men. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against one another, praying the train would stop before they did. That was only the beginning. Over the next months, Moran was shuffled through 4 different prison camps as the German front collapsed. Each move meant more disease, more hunger, more brutality. Then came the hell ship. German authorities forced hundreds of Allied prisoners aboard an aging freighter crossing the Baltic Sea. The men were driven into the hold. No light, no ventilation, one bucket for waste. The hatch slammed shut. For 4 days, they existed in total darkness. Men with dysentery couldn't reach the bucket. The stench became unbearable. Bodies piled among the living. Some prisoners screamed. Others went silent. When the hatch finally opened, survivors emerged blinking into daylight, barely human. The ship delivered them to another camp. More wire, more towers, more waiting. By early 1945, artillery thundered in the distance. Soviet forces pushed from the east. Allied armies closed in from the west. Guards grew nervous. Rumors spread. Something was coming. On February 6, 1945, it arrived. Orders were given. The camp would be evacuated immediately. All prisoners would march west. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Eugene Moran had survived the sky. Now he would be tested on the ground. The order was simple: walk west or die. On February 6, 1945, in temperatures plunging to 20 below zero, German guards forced thousands of Allied prisoners out of the camps and onto frozen roads. No destination, no timetable, no mercy. This evacuation would later be known as the Black March, one of the longest and deadliest forced marches of Allied prisoners in Europe. Among them was Eugene Moran. He weighed barely more than 90 pounds. His arms had healed wrong, stiff, and weak. The metal plate in his skull conducted the cold straight into his brain, igniting constant pain. His ribs, never properly healed, stabbed him with every breath. And now he was expected to walk hundreds of miles through snow and ice on starvation rations. The column stretched for miles. Guards marched alongside with rifles raised. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Anyone who tried to escape was shot. Bodies were left where they fell, half buried in snow, like grim mile markers. They walked 15 to 20 miles a day, through blizzards, through freezing rain, through villages stripped bare by war. At night they slept in barns filled with animal waste, or collapsed in open fields, huddled together for warmth. Food came from anywhere. It could be stolen raw potatoes, frozen beets, scraps scavenged from abandoned farms. Water came from ditches contaminated with sewage. Men died every day. Some collapsed and never rose again. Others burned with fever by morning and were gone by nightfall. Dysentery, pneumonia, typhus, frostbite that turned black and rotted. Guards didn't wait. A rifle shot ended the delay. Moran kept walking. One step, then another, then another. He had not survived a 4-mile fall from the sky to surrender on a frozen road. He had not endured shattered bones, crude surgery, starvation, and captivity to quit now. Something inside him, something forged at 24,000 feet, when his world came apart, refused to stop. By March, the sound of artillery grew louder. By April, it was unmistakable. Germany was collapsing. On April 26, 1945, near the Elbe River, the march ended. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column. The German guards dropped their weapons. Some fled. Others surrendered without a word. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. Then reality hit. They were free. Moran barely understood it at first. He was skeletal, exhausted beyond exhaustion, alive by sheer stubbornness. Medics rushed in horrified by what they found: men reduced to shadows, bodies consumed by starvation and disease. Moran had entered the army at 150 pounds. He now weighed 93. His records would later confirm the impossible. Shot down over Bremen, fell 24,000 feet without a parachute, survived catastrophic injuries, endured 17 months of captivity, a hell ship, and a 600-mile death march. Only 3 men in the entire war survived falls like his. Eugene Moran was one of them. The farm boy from Wisconsin had walked out of hell, and he wasn't done living yet. When the war finally released its grip, Eugene Moran returned to the United States looking nothing like the boy who had left. He was 21 years old, but decades older in every way that mattered. His body carried permanent damage, arms weakened by shattered bones, ribs that ached with every storm, and a metal plate in his skull that throbbed with constant reminders of November 29, 1943. The Army studied his file in disbelief. Shot down over Bremen, aircraft destroyed, fell 24,000 feet in a severed tail section with no working parachute, survived impact, captured, held prisoner for 17 months, survived starvation, infection, a hell ship, and a forced march across a collapsing Reich. Only 3 Allied airmen survived falls like that during the entire war. Moran received 2 Purple Hearts, 1 for each shattered arm. He was awarded the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the European Theater Medal, and an honorable discharge in December 1945. The paperwork was neat and official, but it couldn't capture what he had endured or what he had lost. He went home to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. The farm looked the same. The sky was the same. Planes still passed overhead. But Eugene Moran was not. He married Margaret Finley, a woman who had known him before the war and who chose to love the man who came back. Together they built a quiet life, a small farm, 9 children, church on Sundays, work that demanded strength he sometimes didn't have. For more than 60 years, Moran almost never spoke about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to neighbors who asked. Talking meant reliving the screaming metal, the endless fall, the faces of 8 crewmates who never came home. Silence became his armor. The nightmares never stopped, but life went on. Moran raised his family. He worked until his body wouldn't let him anymore. He watched grandchildren grow. He lived long enough to see a new century, something that should have been stolen from him 4 miles above Germany. Recognition came late. In 2007, Wisconsin awarded him the first ever Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. His story finally reached historians and journalists. A local teacher began recording his memories, breaking 6 decades of silence. That work would become Tailspin, published in 2022, the full account of the tail gunner who fell from the sky and lived. A street in his hometown was named Eugene Moran Way. On March 23, 2014, Eugene Moran died at the age of 89. His life followed a simple philosophy, one he lived by: to the end I would rather wear out than rust out. On November 29, 1943, he occupied the loneliest seat in the sky. And when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he didn't wait for death. He fought all the way down. And then, against all odds, he kept living. History is full of numbers. Aircraft lost, missions flown, casualties recorded. Statistics neat enough to fit into books and archives. But every once in a while, a single story breaks through those numbers and refuses to stay buried. Eugene Moran was never supposed to be remembered. Tail gunners rarely were. They sat alone at the back of the bomber, isolated from the crew, first target for enemy fighters, last to know if the aircraft was dying. When bombers vanished over Germany, the men in the tail vanished with them. No witnesses, no last words, just another line on a casualty report. Moran should have been one of those lines. Instead, he became an exception so extreme that even military historians struggled to explain it. Only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes, and all 3 did so by riding pieces of wreckage that slowed their descent just enough to keep death at bay. Miracle wasn't a word the military liked to use, but no other word fit. For decades, Moran lived quietly, carrying the weight of survival, while so many others never made it home. 8 crewmates died aboard Rikki Tikki Tavi. Hundreds more from the 96th bomb group vanished over Europe. Some were shot down. Some burned. Some disappeared into forests, oceans, and prison camps, never to return. Moran remembered them all. That was part of the burden. When his story finally emerged through interviews, records, and the work that became Tailspin, it wasn't just about a man who fell 4 miles and lived. It was about what survival costs. The scars that don't show in photographs. The silence that stretches across decades. The guilt of being the one who came back. In 2008, Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, named a street Eugene Moran Way. A small gesture perhaps, but permanent. A reminder etched into the place where he once watched airplanes fly overhead and dreamed of joining them. When Moran died in 2014, he left behind more than a survival story. He left proof. Proof that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like endurance, like refusing to let go when gravity wore and history itself say you should. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran fell from the sky. He should have disappeared into silence. He didn't. And because stories like his are still being told, he never will. On November 29, 1943, the sky over Germany tried to erase Eugene Moran. Flak tore his bomber apart. Fighters shattered his body. Gravity dragged him 4 miles towards certain death. War did everything it could to finish the job, and it failed. What makes Moran's story endure isn't just that he survived the impossible, it's how he did it. When his aircraft split in half, he didn't surrender. When his arms were shattered, he kept firing. When his parachute was destroyed, he didn't panic. When the tail section fell, he fought the sky itself. And when the war dragged him through hospitals, prison camps, starvation, a hell ship, and a frozen death march, he kept putting one foot in front of the other. Most men are tested once in a lifetime. Moran was tested again and again by physics, by medicine, by cruelty, by chance. Each time the answer was the same: not yet. He returned home carrying scars no medal could explain. He lived quietly, worked hard, raised a family, and spoke little about what he had endured. Not because the story wasn't extraordinary, but because the cost of remembering was too high. For decades, history nearly lost him. But history doesn't get the final word. Today, Eugene Moran stands as more than a survivor. He represents every airman who climbed into a bomber knowing the odds. Every tail gunner who sat alone at the back of the aircraft, staring into empty sky, waiting for shapes that meant death. Every young man who didn't come home. Moran did. Not because he was invincible, not because he was lucky, but because when everything said it was over, he refused to stop. He once summed up his life with a simple line, "I'd rather wear out than rust out." On that November morning, falling through fire and silence, Eugene Moran didn't rust out. He wore the war down. And in doing so, he made sure that even the loneliest man in the sky would never be forgotten. There are places in war where survival feels almost impossible. The tail gunner's position on a B-17 was one of them. Alone, isolated, 40 feet from the rest of the crew. First target for enemy fighters, last to know if the aircraft was already dying. When bombers disappeared over Germany, the man in the tail often vanished without witnesses. On November 29, 1943, that seat belonged to Eugene Moran, and history expected him to disappear. Instead, he rewrote the rules. He fought when his aircraft was crippled. He fought when his arms were shattered. He fought while falling 4 miles through the sky inside a torn-off piece of wreckage. And when the war tried to finish the job on the ground through infection, starvation, captivity, forced marches and cold, he fought on in silence. Not for medals, not for recognition, not for history, just to live. For more than 60 years after the war, Moran rarely spoke of what happened. The screams of tearing metal, the endless fall, the faces of crewmates who never came home. Silence became his way of honoring them. But silence doesn't mean absence. Today, his story stands for every bomber crew that climbed into the sky knowing the odds. For every tail gunner who stared into empty air, waiting for shapes that meant death. For every young man who never returned, and for the rare few who did. Eugene Moran was not supposed to survive. He was not supposed to be remembered. He was not supposed to grow old, raise a family, or see the world change. Yet he did. Because on the loneliest seat in the sky, when everything else fell away, he made one final decision: not today. And as long as stories like his are told, the men who fell from the sky, those who lived, and those who didn't, will never fade into silence again.